One of the things that I find always so interesting is to hear from people about the role of emotion in their own work. Often we think about, academic research as this thing in the head, but in fact, some of the best research emerges out of these like affective spaces. And so I was wondering whether you'd be willing to share something with us on that topic.
I'm a mother to a 7-year-old, a single mother, in fact, to a 7-year-old expat child. And that opened up many windows and doors, like does feature in my research and work, because now I'm looking at different perspectives and how everyone feels about the precarious nature of living in the Gulf.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are so happy to have with us today Mira Al-Hussein, whom I am so privileged to be able to be in conversation with, because I got to know Mira not in person, but rather through these super interesting spaces that she was curating online. Somebody who gave me the kind of food for thought that I so desperately needed when we were sort of homebound during this COVID pandemic. And I felt when I had attended these talks that she had organized that I was developing a sense or a connection to a community of people that not only did I not know existed necessarily, but weren't even really in conversation with one another. And so I think she's somebody that is really going to give us a sort of a new perspective on what it means to think about research, academic research, and how it sort of interfaces with real life and interfaces with communities of people, both who are in academia as an institution, but also who are just normal people, like people, outside of the ivory tower. Mira is currently at Cambridge University, and she's doing her doctoral work on educational institutions, gender, and the state. So it's actually a perfect opportunity for us to connect with her, since we are reading about the national family as part of our class, Women and Work in the Gulf. So Mira, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, May. Thank you for the very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to your expectations again.
Most definitely. So maybe we'll start off with that, actually. I remember the last time we were talking about the kind of spaces that you were kind of designing online, curating online. I referred to them as Zoom talks. And then you, in referring back to them to me, told me I'd like to call them inclusive conversations. Those inclusive conversations, the ones at least that I attended, were 3 topics: expats in the Gulf, which featured Neha Vora, but also 2 other people who held kind of like different perspectives on the same issue. So Yasar Jarrar on the policy side, and the ambassador to the UAE, the UAE's ambassador to Russia. The second talk was on social distancing, which is a cool term, but actually it was about intersectionality in the Gulf. So it was really looking at sort of race and gender and how those two intersect in a variety of ways. You had invited a Desi Khadiji, a Black Kuwaiti, and a half Emirati, half Palestinian, to kind of really talk about how does race sort of like feature in their life. And then the last one is An-Nasawi al-Khalijiyya, which is Gulf Feminisms. And that's a talk actually that I made available to my students because it's in Arabic and not everybody was able to access it. But it was really interesting to hear about self-identified Gulf feminists who aren't necessarily speaking simply from the perspective of state feminism. They were really sort of addressing different kinds of angles, intersectionality, post-colonial feminism, so on and so forth. And so I just want to tell you that essentially your Zoom talks could in fact be a textbook for my class on women and work in the Gulf in like virtual format. So I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about the logic behind this, like why did you decide to do this, and also about the choices of speakers. So kind of how did you think about doing this, and maybe towards the end to hear what do you think it's doing, out there in the world.
So, May, I'd like to say for a starter that actually, yes, they are content. They're supposed to serve as content. For researchers, actually, that was the incentive to create these virtual talks or inclusive conversations. Now, I research higher education in the UAE, and one of the incentives or motives for me to research higher education in the UAE was an observation I had through from 2011 through 2015, which is the erosion of higher education as a space for meaningful conversations. Increasingly, the conversations or the subjects that were taught were neoliberal, market-oriented topics that are meant to cultivate or kind of equip students to become workers, productive economic workers in the market. And it moved away from the initial, what I think is the initial purpose of higher education, which is to cultivate an enlightened and open-minded human being, a humanist. So I felt like there are different factors involved, socioeconomic, but also political, the permeation of, if you will, the foreign policy of different states, state interests, and these things shape the higher education experience for students. So we no longer had conversations that were meaningful, that were grassroots, that touched upon the personal lives of people. Experiences like, feminism, racism, microaggressions, or even the question of expatriates in the Gulf. This is very important. And it started off with an article I read at Bloomberg when a journalist basically documented how there was an exodus of expats from the UAE because of COVID, and how the residential longevity was not available to them. And it just stood out to me that not a single Emirati was featured in that article. So I thought, what do Emiratis think about this? Are they worried that their non-Emirati friends are leaving, their neighbors, long-term neighbors are leaving? Are they not? Are they happy? We don't know, because they're not even part of that conversation or that reportage. So I thought, okay, let's have a conversation about this. Let's see what different stakeholders think about this, mainly what expats really think. And that's basically, that gave birth to this whole inclusive conversation. But the main idea was, we do not want experts, quote unquote, to be talking about this issue. We want real people experiencing this to tell us how they feel. And it was very difficult to find people who were based in the Gulf who are willing to talk, because they felt there was a lot at stake. So therefore, the choices were based on who was willing to speak, rather than who should be speaking. And Nehavora is an academic who spent some time doing ethnographic fieldwork in the Gulf, documenting the lives of impossible citizens. That's the title of her first book, The Indian Diaspora in Dubai, who actually are just emotional citizens. And I'm quoting someone, this is an engagement on Twitter where someone said, "I'm an emotional citizen of the Gulf." So this documentation of different forms of economic citizenship, emotional citizenship, cultural citizenship, just gave birth to this conversation. How do you where do you see yourselves in the long term? Do you see yourselves being here? How do you want to be here? What kind of securities do you aspire for? And how do different stakeholders view these very reasonable demands? And this is why we thought someone like a former ambassador, who is also an assistant minister for cultural diplomacy, might be able to address. I don't think he's necessarily succeeded. He did a lot of beating around the bush, but something you would expect from a diplomat, I guess. And the reception was great. And we thought, okay, that worked. Maybe we can do something even, more interesting. And Black Lives Matter was there happening in the background. And we thought, okay, we can bring this conversation home. because we also struggle with different types of racism and microaggressions. And we decided to call it social distancing, just because the other people I work with were very reluctant to name the elephant in the room, and they wanted to shy away from racism. And then I thought of Lomva, who in her book about migrants in Kuwait and expats in Kuwait described the different modes of distancing. And then she said there's also social distancing. And I thought, okay, this is applicable. Then we can refer to it as social distancing, because that is actually what it is. You socially distance in different ways, through language, through performing citizenship, through exclusions, different forms of exclusions. And we thought of the different forms of exclusions in the Gulf, and they were not restricted to color or ethnicity. There were also different cultural forms of exclusions, and we wanted to include the Bidoon experience as well, but the different people who we approached didn't feel comfortable talking. So luckily we had 3 speakers, and that was a handful. And then we moved on to, we wanted to launch something in Arabic, because someone commented on Twitter, and there's always engagement. There's a conversation that happens right after every inclusive conversation, a virtual conversation, people interacting with the content, commenting on the speakers or the interactions that happened. And one person said, you're still maintaining an elitist attitude by having these conversations in English. Why can't you have these conversations in Arabic? And my response was, if we're going to be inclusive, we cannot continue excluding the people we're talking to and about. So if we're going to talk about expats, we have to recognize that the majority, the largest demographic of expats are people from the subcontinent. So this conversation will have to be in English. We already have these conversations in Arabic in our social media, in our Arabic social media, and it's always exclusive to people who are in power, who talk about the other rather than talk with the other. The same thing with the social distancing talk. We wanted to include the Desi Khaliji experience, because it's a very important experience. They experienced a lot of these exclusions and microaggressions and condescending talk. And Nasawi al-Khalijiyya, the Gulf feminism, was probably a conversation that we could have, I wouldn't say privately, but not necessarily include others. Now, also another thing I wanted to mention is that these conversations not only excluded expert or traditional expert, but your traditional white experts, because they tend to speak for us for many reasons. Because one reason, I think we have an inferiority complex, a collective inferiority complex, where we think that a white scholar probably knows better. But then there's also what Neha Vora said. She said, I can say things that people in the Gulf cannot say. So we generally trust white scholars to be able to get away with saying things that they will not be penalized for. But if I were to say the same things, I would be the subject of derision, or even worse, there would be very worrisome repercussions. And I wanted to steer away from that and start a conversation between us, find a way to talk about difficult topics, have difficult conversations, sugarcoat, use your euphemisms, your $10 words, use whatever you want, but you don't have to address the issue directly. You can circumvent, go around it, but you can have this conversation. And this is what I wanted to promote through these talks. Have the conversation no matter how difficult it is. And that's how it started.
That's so interesting, honestly. And I think, in some ways, so maybe even the reframing of these as inclusive conversations ought to be inclusive, difficult conversations, right? Like that's the crux of the matter, actually, of really kind of getting at what does it mean to sort of talk about something, not just as an issue, but as an issue that addresses who else is in the room, who else gets to speak on behalf of who, and in what way. And I think this question that you're raising about the sort of politics of location, how in some ways, certain locations can either privilege a person's, ability to speak about or speak with or not, is, one of the kind of foundational things that we've been thinking about a lot in our class together. And one of the ways that we have been sort of trying to think about what that means in the context of an educational institution is, how do we engage in situated knowledge? How do we kind of view an academic text not simply as knowledge bearing, simply because it's been written by an expert, but as potentially knowledge bearing, but also ought to be situated in relation to a particular geographic location of where it was produced and by whom and for what purpose and what kind of conversation was it trying to be a part of, that kind of thing. And it doesn't necessarily lead to one correct answer, but it does engage you in this process where you're constantly thinking about who's speaking on behalf of who and why. And so I love, kind of hearing about your narrative of how you went about that as you designed your inclusive, difficult conversations. And perhaps we could kind of move towards this idea of what does it mean to sort of speak from a place by moving away from what you're doing to actually who you are, and sort of your own lived experience and how that's featured in the research topic that you're pursuing at Cambridge University, but also in the kinds of ways that you want to engage with an academic community. If you could share with us a little bit about sort of like what your lived experience was in the UAE, or maybe even specifically at Zayed University, I think it could be potentially helpful for us as a group to kind of understand how to situate your work.
So I had graduated from Zayed University, and Zayed University, I feel it was to a certain degree, it still is a very important space for women. And when I first joined Zayed University, it was a new project, and it was a state project to import liberal arts education from America, from the States, to the UAE. And the fact that it was exclusive to women at that point made it even more special. So as women, we felt special, that we didn't have to drive all the way to Al Ain for that kind of education. It has been brought home to us. And for many of us, it was the first time to be taught by non-Arab, non-Asian males. There were white male teachers and white female teachers. That was the first encounter, if you will, with the other. The othering of that other has always existed, because everybody else who was not white, every other non-white person was not the other, because we always had that kind of interaction. We were always a community that was multicultural, if you will. Segregated, yes, but multicultural nevertheless. So for many of us, that was a site of contention, a site of identity construction too, against the other. That's where you construct your identity. That's where you define who you are, because there was a visible other who looked very different, who spoke very differently and carried very different ideas. But that other was in a position of power. That other was there to impart knowledge that you were supposed to filter, take in what's good, leave out what's not good, whatever that is that you would not fit into your culture, into your frame. And it was a very interesting experience of creating your own frame and taking what you want and leaving out what you didn't want. And for many years, you thought that what you wanted was actually your own construction. But then with time and in retrospect, I realized through my research that actually, no, it was defined for us. And we were inculcated and we were socialized into thinking that this frame is yours. Here, we're handing it to you. Take what is useful. And useful has already been predefined. It's not a personal experience. So for many years, Zayed University has had been really a site of encounters and it was beautiful. It really graduated some beautiful minds and characters. And I decided to go back to teach there because that was my way of giving back. And I joined in 2011, a very interesting year because geopolitically in the region, that was a year of change. I'm trying to be very diplomatic about the words I use right now. So these changes translated within the spaces of higher education. So this is probably a euphemism for many things, but until 2013, Zayed University did not have an outer fence, the Dubai campus. But then 2013, they spent money creating a fence, which I thought really was symbolic of what happened inside the university in terms of curricula, in terms of the policy, recruitment policy, changes in deliverables, learning outcomes, and so forth. What used to be a liberal arts university suddenly became a vocational institution that wants to graduate economic, productive citizens. And the conversations that we had in the past, many conversations around anthropological themes, sociological themes, things that really made us reflect on who we are, what we are as a society, as a country, as global citizens, if you will, were no longer had. And that's when I decided to do my PhD and research this phenomena and kind of try to trace the origins of this shift.
That's great. I have something else that I wanted to ask you about that, but do you want us to share any of the images that you sent to me? If you want to add anything to that.
I'd like to talk for a bit about the gates, the entrance gates. So these are the entry gates at Zayed University, the obviously female campus. Men don't have to scan their IDs, but women, female students, have to scan their IDs upon entering university and exiting university. This has always existed. Even when I was a student at Zayed University, that was the case. But in 2013, when management changed, when management was nationalized, a text message system was instituted such that upon entrance and exit, the student's guardian receives a text message saying, Mira entered university at this hour. Mira left university at this hour. This system, as it is, was problematic for me even as a student at Zayed University. I felt very restricted. I felt like I was denied the opportunity to become an adult because these gates, sort of the way I saw them, they wanted me to shed who I was at the gate upon entry so that I'm able to be recipient to whatever information and education, liberal arts education I was receiving inside the university. But then upon exiting university, I had to leave all that behind. I had to put all that information, that empowering information behind in my locker and go back to being the daughter, being the female subject, being the person who needs guardianship. So I entered as an adult, but I left my adulthood inside, checked in. So for the longest time, that was problematic for me, but I couldn't articulate it. So when I went back to research higher education in the UAE as an instructor, but also as a researcher, I didn't have to scan my ID. Suddenly, upon graduating from Zayed University and becoming an employee rather than a student, within 2-3 months, you no longer have to scan your ID. So I went and asked students, I interviewed students about how they felt about having to scan their ID. And I realized there's so many modes of articulation and contestation and struggle happening in the conversation, whereby as an Emirati, I was not trusted to be told the truth about how they felt, because I was an Emirati, one of them, asking them, they felt they had to tell me the correct answer rather than tell me how they truly feel, because they had to safeguard their dignity and honor, and they wanted to protect themselves and their minds from being judged by this Emirati researcher. Because if they if they were to tell me that I don't like this system, I want to have the freedom to leave and come as I please, I felt that in their minds, and I could be interpreting my interviewees, by the way, so take whatever I say with a bucket load of salt. I felt that they were telling me what they thought I wanted to hear, because I should view them as honorable women who didn't feel the need to be free because they are free. Why would they need to be free and leave and come as they please unless they have ulterior motives that are not decent? When I went and read other research conducted by other scholars about the same topic, the responses that were generated in their research were very different. Women struggled, women expressed their struggles, their indignation, their unhappiness and discontent with these gates. But then with me, every person, every female I had interviewed said, oh, I was uncomfortable at first, but I think this is okay, this is for our protection. So as Langva says, they employed or deployed the discourse of protection. We are valuable, therefore we are being protected. Then again, there's this self-censorship that's happening only with me as an Emirati researcher. So how much am I able to generate in terms of true conversations, true feelings? I guess not so much when you have to self-censor. They self-surveil, as Foucault says. There's always this surveillance of the self happening because you feel surveilled by the other. And then, of course, there was another thing happening at the gate. So these women, the same women who said that they were happy with the gates, they were content, they were okay with them, they didn't mind them, struggled with the security guards who they saw as inferior to them, because these security guards were people from the subcontinent and different, non-Western, non-Emirati subjectivities who were contesting their entry and exit. Where's your ID card? You must scan your ID card. And the women struggled and resisted and fought back and talked back. But once they've crossed that entry point, they were okay again with the gates. They didn't feel like they had to resist. So it was interesting how I would say modes of social distancing or microaggression or I would say racial perceptions sort of transpired at the gate too.
That is so interesting, Mira. And I think in many ways, one of the kind of things that are so interesting about the research process is, in a way, the difference between kind of what people say about themselves in a given context and what they actually do, and how to reconcile those together. And also the kinds of ways that you're describing your own positionality in relation to your interviewees. So sort of like really reading into their responses, not just simply these are reflections of opinions that, are this or that, but also these are reflections of opinions that are being shared with you and the relationship that they're having with you, based on ideas that they have about what that ought to be. And I think that that's very powerful. And in many ways, requires, I think, a degree of self-awareness about like what's actually operating in that situation, but also can lead to really good like research questions, the way that you're describing about like, how is it that something that has happened at a certain point in time gets talked about in a certain way that maybe is not historically accurate or is shaped by, this particular point in time. So that's really very, very interesting. And I have one last question before sort of we go to break. And this actually is tied a little bit to this example that you just shared with us, which is very much sort of centered on your own research. But we are also at the point in the semester where we've been reading texts about the national family. And we're reading texts by different authors, Frances Hasso, but also others who have written about what does it mean to think about the family, not just as this kind of like natural thing, but as an institution, and as an institution that interfaces with the state, with the market, with other states, you know, kind of in a transnational context. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about sort of how the family features in your life, you know, you know, the reason I'm asking this is because one of the things that I find always so interesting is to hear from people about the role of emotion in their own work. Often we think about, you know, academic research as this thing in the head, but in fact, some of the best research emerges out of these like affective spaces. And so I was wondering whether you'd be willing to share something with us on that topic.
I'm sorry to say that I've only become attuned to the struggles of the expat community after becoming the mother to an expat child. I'm embarrassed to say that I've not been aware of, you know, many struggles and maybe not paid attention before. But I'm a mother to a single mother, in fact, to a 7-year-old expat child. And that opened up many windows and doors, like really open, like cowboy style. It just really does feature in my my research and work, because now I'm looking at different perspectives and how everyone feels about the precarious nature of living in the Gulf for non-Gulf citizens. And it's very interesting because my location has also led to me asking these relevant questions in the inclusive, difficult conversations, the virtual ones, because the expat question affects me directly. What happens to my son beyond a certain point? But then also what happens to me as a female, whether I self-describe as feminist or not? What happens to me as the mother of an expat? Why am I half a citizen? So in the social distancing virtual talk, we hosted Emirati filmmaker Amal Al-Agroubi, and she is half Syrian, and she had produced a movie about half Emiratis and their experiences. And I sat through the movie, and I remember saying to her, "Listen, I'm an Emirati citizen who also feels half Emirati, not because I have a parent who is non-Emirati. Both my parents are Emirati, but guess what? Actually, I'm half Emirati because I have half the rights of a male citizen. Therefore, I am also half." So there are different layers, if you will, of exclusions operating towards different people. Forget ethnicity, forget sub-racial cultures. There's also the male-female divide. And a lot of women will contest that and say, no, we are empowered. Great, I love that. I love that they feel empowered. But then who you are, where you are in this hierarchical state also really reflects the level of empowerment you experience. You might be content with where you are, but if you're not a mother to an expat child, your level of empowerment is very different than mine. And the same, obviously, can be said about women from the Northern Emirates, who, because of the conservative family situation, cannot maybe drive or access higher education, or have, their work situation depends on where they live and so forth. So it really depends. I can't say that people are empowered or not. It really is a very subjective personal experience of empowerment. So my location and my space and my location as a female in the Emirates features in my research. It's very personal, and I think these are the conversations that have to be had, and they're not, because often people continue to produce and recycle existing research on existing themes. Women in business, women in high positions of political positions of power. It's repetitive. It's overdone. What about women who are not? And I remember wanting to put together a talk, which never materialized, of Emirati women for the Emirati Women's Day. And I was looking for a housewife who wanted to talk about her experience being an Emirati woman, because we continue to celebrate Emirati women who are visible, who are out there doing something, being economically productive. What about the woman doing the invisible emotional and physical labor at home? Why is she not celebrated? We continue to celebrate the family and the importance of mothers and whatnot, but they remain invisible. They're not featured in the magazines. No one talks about these women. So yeah, this is where my personal location influences my research.
Wow, that's really great. I have to say that it's, in a way, always so grounding when you kind of hear, people kind of describe who they are as a way to continue to be curious about the world, but also as a way to generate more knowledge for others who may be in the same situation, or for others who may not be aware of that situation, right? Like, just simply because that's not the life that they lead. And so in some ways, it sounds to me that this idea of inclusive, difficult conversations is really actually, I'm renaming it again now, but generative conversations. I mean, these are really exchanges that hopefully produce new kinds of spaces, for people in this kind of constructive way, not just simply, poking holes in sort of like existing frameworks, but really trying to produce new ones.
So one of the things I reflected on was being an Emirati, wearing an abaya and a shayla when accessing two different sites, a private university and a public university, which is Zayed University. Because I worked there and I'm still associated with Zayed University, access was very easy. Getting people to interview with me was very easy. But then I wasn't very sure if students said yes because I was in a position of power, not as a researcher, but as someone they identified as an instructor. So they said yes because they thought they were going to earn some brownie points of some sort deferred to the future, or because they felt I'm an Emirati, I look like them, I dress like them. I could not tell for sure, but I felt disadvantaged. Whereas before accessing the site, I thought that's gonna work in my favor. I thought it's gonna be easier than going to a private university, being viewed very suspiciously as probably an agent of the state trying to track people and kind of finding out what they're thinking. It turned out to be quite the opposite. It was more challenging to get people to talk honestly about how they felt. Because I was an Emirati, I felt they self-censored, not the faculty, not the staff, but the students. They self-censored because they didn't want to be judged by a fellow Emirati. Whereas in the private university, it was the complete opposite. At first, building rapport took longer. I spent more time in the site trying to kind of become a familiar face, get people to sort of trust that I am not on any particular side. I was just curious. Students, especially non-Emirati students in the private university, were happy to talk. In fact, they felt like this is our opportunity, this is our chance to tell our side of the story and have it reported. Especially there's a guarantee for anonymity. So yeah. Whereas with the Emiratis, it's hard to be anonymous because it's a small country. Everybody supposedly knows everybody. So even if I were to say your anonymity and confidentiality is guaranteed, they'd be like, not for you, not for your head. Back to your question, the first question about emotional citizenship. It was also the first time I've heard it from this guy. He's Desi Khaliji, based in Oman. Look him up on Twitter. His name is Mani Shankar. So Mani contacted me after the social distancing, the expat virtual talk, and he said, "Thank you for doing this, because I'm an emotional citizen of the Gulf, of Oman, and of the UAE. I've lived here all my life, and I'm not here because of economics or money. Even if I were to make much more elsewhere, I belong here. The spaces that I've circulated around since childhood are home, are familiar. I know no other home. Therefore, I am here because I love being here. I associate myself and my history here, the history of my family here." So a lot of the time, literature on migrant workers, and if you're seeing my air quotes, the migrant thing is also is such a political term. Let's just, for the sake of this conversation, refer to them as guest workers. These permanent guests are not only there because of work opportunities. Maybe their parents were attracted to the Gulf because of these the oil boom and work opportunities, but the children don't stay on simply because of that. Whereas they have a better opportunity to be educated elsewhere, to travel, to go to the West maybe. Many of them, even if they do come back because that's home. Now, with regards to the second question, which I find it very important, and personally, I am really emotionally, embroiled in this whole Palestine justice thing. I think who talks and who does not talk and who can talk, it's a very interesting question. In fact, a person posted on Twitter saying that the rentier state theory that constantly highlights the contractual relationship between the subjects and the state often implies that the subjects or citizens are passive. They have no voice, or indifferent or apathetic about what happens elsewhere. As long as their bread and butter and circus is guaranteed, they're okay. That is not true. Many different layers of state surveillance and constraints operate here to silence or censor. I remember wanting to put together a talk about decolonization in the Gulf, and two of the speakers I would refer to as Khaliji because they were born and raised there, but are of Palestinian heritage, and they dropped out. And the whole project fell apart because they were the main speakers, and they dropped out because they felt they could no longer speak. They felt they are no longer Khaliji. Their self-designation as Khaliji was compromised by different political changes in the country.
It's been so interesting, actually, thinking about what you just said, even in relation to the academic texts that we read. Sort of like how one constructs an argument depends very much on who the audience is. So what gets said, but also in some cases what doesn't get said, depends on that, and also depends on people's abilities to read between the lines. So I think for a lot of people who have grown up in a variety of contexts in which they understand fully well that it's never really the thing that is said, it's always the subtext or the thing between the lines. You can get really good at figuring out what the real conversation is. Yeah, it's actually, I agree completely with that comment, because I think in some ways othering is usually used to indicate that it's something that makes somebody identified by some group characteristics outside of the thing. But you're almost using it in this other way, other, right? Like you realize that the thing you're seeing is actually not the full picture because you're viewing it through the eyes of the other. And so that's enabling you to see more of what's actually out there. And so, your generative conversations and your flipping of the term other actually come so beautifully together.
I'm totally using that word.
Take it. Be so happy. So happy. So when your book comes out, maybe some of my students are still interested in this topic, and they're gonna be like, yeah, we were there when Mira came up with the term. So, well, thank you so much, Mira. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, May. I enjoyed it more than you guys did.